It started with a glow that shouldn't have been there. In November 1895, German physicist Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was in his lab, experimenting with cathode ray tubes, early vacuum tubes that spat out invisible streams of charged particles. He wrapped one tube in thick black cardboard to keep the light inside. The room went dark. The tube crackled to life, and a screen across the room started to glow. It was coated with a fluorescent chemical called barium platinocyanide. It should have been dead dark. No normal light could escape the tube's cardboard shield and reach it, but there it was, a ghostly green shimmer every time he switched the tube on. Röntgen didn't shrug and move on. He did what obsessed people do. He basically moved into the lab, eating there, sleeping there, testing everything in sight. He found that whatever these new rays were, they could pass through books, stacks of paper, even pieces of wood. But metal stopped them. Then he tried something bolder. He put his wife Anna Bertha's hand between the tube and a photographic plate. After a long exposure, an image emerged, the bones of her hand and her wedding ring floating in the dark. It became the first X-ray image of a human body part. When she saw it, she reportedly said, "I have seen my death." Within a year, doctors around the world were using these mysterious rays to find bullets, fractures, and tumors inside the living. Röntgen would win the very first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901 for a discovery that began with one stubborn, unexplained glow. We like to think science is about answers, but this whole branch of medicine exists because one man refused to look away from a question. How many weird glitches in our own lives do we dismiss? That might be the start of something we don't have words for yet. London, September 1928. A Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming drags himself back into his lab at St. Mary's Hospital after a holiday. His desk is chaos. Stacks of Petri dishes full of Staphylococcus aureus, the bacteria that can cause boils, sore throats, and deadly infections. He starts sorting, ready to throw most of them away, and then he freezes. One dish looks wrong. A blue-green mold has crept in from the edge like a tiny invader. But that's not the strange part. Around the mold, the deadly bacteria are gone. There's a clear halo where nothing grows at all. Beyond that ring, the bacteria look normal, like a clean edge between life and death, drawn in a perfect circle. Fleming reportedly mutters, "That's funny," which is scientist code for "this might be huge." He isolates the mold, identifies it as a species now known as Penicillium rubens, and calls the mystery substance it makes penicillin, a kind of chemical shield that kills certain bacteria but not human cells. At first, almost nobody cares. Producing enough of this fragile stuff is a nightmare. For a decade, penicillin sits mostly as an interesting lab curiosity. Then, in 1939, a team in Oxford led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain figures out how to purify and mass produce it. By World War II, penicillin is saving soldiers from infections that used to be automatic death sentences. Today, historians estimate that first messy plate moment has helped save hundreds of millions of lives, possibly around 500 million. All because one scientist didn't clean up before vacation. It started with a problem anyone would recognize. Art Fry was a scientist, but on Sundays he sang in his church choir, and his paper bookmarks kept falling out of his hymn book. It was annoying. Meanwhile, his colleague Spencer Silver had a failure on his hands. He'd accidentally created an adhesive that was barely sticky. You could peel it off and re-stick it, but it wasn't strong enough for, well, anything. It was a solution without a problem. Until one Sunday. Frustrated with his runaway bookmarks, Art Fry had an idea. What if he used Spencer's failed glue on his bookmarks? He tried it. The paper stayed put, but more importantly, it peeled right off without tearing the page. That little annoyance in church, combined with a failed experiment, gave birth to one of the most useful office supplies ever invented, the Post-it note. In the late 1950s, American engineer Wilson Greatbatch was in his workshop, building a simple device to record heart sounds in animals. He reached into a parts bin, grabbed what he thought was the correct resistor, and picked the wrong one. When he wired it in, the circuit didn't produce a smooth recording signal at all. Instead, it pulsed. Looped up, looped up. The irregular circuit was firing in a steady rhythm, eerily like a heartbeat. Greatbatch stared at the blinking output and realized what his mistake had given him, not a better recorder, but the core of a device that could drive a heartbeat itself. Out of that failed experiment came the first implantable cardiac pacemaker, small enough to fit into the human body and strong enough to keep a damaged heart in rhythm. Within a few years, patients who would have died from slow, failing hearts were walking around with a battery-powered mistake in their chests, keeping time. In 1945, at a Raytheon lab in Massachusetts, American engineer Percy Spencer was surrounded by the most advanced tech of World War II, radar. Magnetrons, high-power vacuum tubes that spit out microwaves to help Allied forces detect enemy aircraft. He'd grown up poor and largely self-taught, but by then Spencer was a respected radar wizard. One day, while testing an active magnetron, he noticed something strange that most people would have ignored. The chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. The room wasn't hot. The equipment wasn't visibly burning anything. Yet the candy was a mess. Instead of tossing it and moving on, Spencer's curiosity grabbed hold. If microwaves could melt a chocolate bar in his pocket, what else could they do to food? He began experimenting. First, popcorn kernels placed near the magnetron. They started popping, turning into fluffy popcorn without any pan or oil. Next, an egg. One design had the magnetron aimed at an egg in a container. Another engineer leaned in to watch, and the egg exploded in his face from the rapid internal heating. Gross, but effective proof. Spencer realized that if he could contain the microwave energy in a metal box, he could direct it into food safely and efficiently. Raytheon filed for a patent in 1945. By 1947, they were selling the first commercial Rataranch microwave ovens, 6 feet tall, about 750 pounds, water-cooled, using roughly 3,000 watts, and costing the equivalent of several thousand modern dollars. These beasts were meant for restaurants and ships, not tiny kitchens. It took decades of engineering and miniaturization before countertop microwaves became affordable for homes in the 1960s-70s. But the arc of the story never changed. One failed lab moment, a melted candy bar that could be been dismissed, as a nuisance turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry and a device that changed how almost every modern kitchen works. In the 1920s and 30s, farmers across the American and Canadian prairies faced a gruesome mystery. Their cattle were bleeding to death from small cuts or routine procedures. Autopsies showed no obvious disease, just blood that wouldn't clot. A Wisconsin farmer eventually hauled a bucket of dark, unclotted blood to a university lab and slammed it on the table, begging scientists to figure it out. Researchers traced the deaths to moldy sweet clover hay, which contained a compound that blocked vitamin K and destroyed the animal's ability to clot. Chemists isolated the culprit, dicumarol, and later developed warfarin first used as rat poison, then carefully refined into a life-saving blood thinner for humans. The same chemistry that once killed cattle and pests is now used in millions of patients to prevent strokes and deadly clots. A farm disaster quietly became one of medicine's most important drugs. In 1903, French chemist and artist Edouard Benedictus was working in his lab when he accidentally knocked a glass flask off a shelf. He braced for the usual disaster glass shrapnel all over the floor. But when he looked down, something was off. The flask had cracked, but it hadn't exploded into shards. The pieces held their shape, like a broken eggshell still mostly intact. Benedictus investigated and realized that the flask had previously contained a solution of cellulose nitrate, an early plastic. The liquid had evaporated, leaving a thin, invisible film lining the inside. When the glass broke, that clear plastic layer acted like a glue net, holding the fragments together. At first, Benedictus simply noted the oddity and moved on. Only later, after reading about car accidents and injuries from shattered windshields, did he remember the flask and connect the dots. What if glass could be made to crack, but not explode? He began experimenting with laminating glass layering two glass sheets with a plastic film in between. In 1909, he patented his laminated safety glass. Over time, the technology improved and spread, eventually becoming standard in car windshields, building windows, and countless other places where sharp shards can be fatal. Today, when a car windshield cracks into a spider web, but doesn't rain blades of glass into your face, you're seeing that accident replayed, one chemist's clumsiness, one lucky coating. In 1964, at Bell Labs in Holmdel, New Jersey, radio astronomers Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson were using a huge horn, antenna originally built for satellite communications to study faint radio signals from the Milky Way. Their measurements kept being spoiled by an annoying problem, a low, steady background hiss they couldn't get rid of. They did what any good engineers would do. They checked the electronics. They calibrated the system. They ruled out nearby radio interference. They even crawled inside the antenna, cleaned out pigeon droppings, and evicted the birds. In case the noise was a literal mess on the hardware, the hiss remained a uniform signal, equivalent to a few degrees above absolute zero, coming from every direction in the sky. Meanwhile, a team at Princeton University, led by Robert Dick and including Jim Peebles, had been working on calculations predicting that if the Big Bang Theory was correct, the universe should be filled with a faint leftover glow of microwave radiation. Penzias and Wilson, hearing about this work, connected the dots. Their instrument problem wasn't a problem, it was the cosmic microwave background radiation, the cooled-down afterglow of the early universe. 2 companion papers were rushed to the Astrophysical Journal in 1965, one by the Princeton team explaining the theory, and one by Penzias and Wilson describing their measurement of a 3.5 K excess antenna temperature. In 1978, Penzias and Wilson received the Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery. The noise they couldn't eliminate became one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the universe began in a hot, dense state and has been expanding ever since. Sometimes the universe doesn't speak in words. It just hums quietly in the background, and you call it interference until you realize you're hearing the echo of everything.